Hello everyone and welcome back to the show of the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in. Happy Friday. We have made it to the end of the week and this show is a very special edition. We have for you even more college football win projections, totals, and ultimately my predictions, my input as to what you should bet in terms of the over-under on them. We stick in the SEC, but then to conclude, for the first time, I'm breaking down a group of 5 team and all their win projection totals and the implications for the playoff for them. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you guys yet again that you should like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network. It is greatly appreciated by all concerned with the network, especially me and my fellow podcasters. And if you also do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation for now at the link gsmc.cloud. Now, all of this information will surely change once I transition to a live show, which will be happening in 2 weeks' time. I will take a little hiatus, come back, and the show will be live. So make yourselves available to all the features that can help support me and the network as a whole. So whether it be super chat, super thanks, super stickers, anything of that sort, to be a part of the show most importantly, and to support the network if you so choose. But for now, gsmc.cloud is the way to go for any tips or donations or things of that nature. So without further ado, let's jump right into today's show. Let's start off in the SEC, talking win projections. And this team, I really believe, is the epitome of a team in transition. They had a coach, a certain style of coaching that really didn't fit their program, and now they saw past it. They're looking to improve upon themselves, the organization, and the players on the field, create a more positive culture, and most importantly, really make themselves a force to be reckoned with in the SEC. And by doing so, they stripped down a little bit. They stripped down all the fanfare they created in the Jimbo Fisher era and brought in Mike Elko, a fresh coach out of Duke who really brought that program into the national spotlight. And he hired Colin Klein, a perfect offensive coordinator hire for young Connor Wegman to improve his career. So yes, I'm talking about Texas A&M. Now, when I remember the true beginning of the Texas A&M era where became more relevant, when Johnny Manziel was there and he was creating excitement surrounding this program, winning Heismans left and right, it seemed that Texas A&M were triumphing despite the fact that Johnny Manziel was such a public figure. But by hiring many years later, almost a decade or so later, a coach that really valued not necessarily money over talent, but not knowing how to use that talent, valuing recruiting for the sake of recruiting's sake. It really kind of set up this whole negative aura surrounding Texas A&M, so to speak. It really set them up in this place where you don't necessarily have much hope outside of, well, you think that these recruits will perform, but it's all about Jimbo Fisher's control. And all this control really led to where they were last season. It was a dark place for Texas A&M, program that wants to compete in the SEC. Is always in the picture because of this tension that Jimbo Fisher brings, and not necessarily of the positive sort. It all stemmed to a place where Texas A&M couldn't necessarily do that. But now they bring in Mike Elko. It seems like a fresh new start. And with a schedule that has a lot of exciting games, I do believe that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. There is optimism surrounding this program again. And look at the over-under for them, 8.5 wins, which is where a lot of those teams trying to make a push into the playoffs, I consider, are sitting at 8.5 wins. So necessarily an 8-4 season, maybe not a playoff season, even in the 12-team CFP. But if Texas A&M were to win 9 games, maybe they would be in the consideration, if they play well enough in their 9 wins to help mitigate those 3 losses. So the questions surrounding Texas A&M now are, well, can Mike Elko, in a positive way, make them more humble, make them eat humble pie, so to speak, in terms of how they transition. Because what I like about the hire, and I mentioned Colin Klein in this hiring situation as well, Texas A&M's huge problem, like I said, was swinging for the fences, when in fact there are teams that have been successful gleaning more talent out of lesser recruits than teams that just go for all the 5-star recruits and not necessarily tap into their potential and really make them show that they are 5-star recruits. And that's what Texas A&M was doing in the Jimbo Fisher era. Now that Mike Elko's in, I think that not necessarily a small school mindset will be implemented, but a mindset where any player that comes into the Texas A&M program is welcome. It's not like there are a ton of 5-star recruits, and if you're, say, a 3-star recruit or something of that nature, you don't necessarily feel like you're going to get playing time. No, I think that this culture is going to be a good culture. That's what I mean. And I think that by becoming more oriented towards this inviting sense of acceptance of all players, that would make Texas A&M exponentially better. Now, when I look at this roster, I definitely feel like there's talent there, but the story being told is that the talent has to be got from somewhere. As of right now, you have Noah Thomas, Ja'Day Walker, and Moose Muhammad as the only 3 wide receivers who have been with this program for a decent amount of time. And all of them has shown flash of potential. That's what I always think about Texas A&M wide receivers, flashes of potential. But whether it be because of coaching, whether it be because, all these 5-star recruits have been fighting for playing time, they haven't necessarily put together a well-rounded enough season where either 1 or 2 of them can be seen as true go-to targets for Connor Wegman. And remember, Connor Wegman, I do have belief in this kid, but he hasn't played a full college football season. And in order to truly understand the nuances of playing in college football, I do think that you need to have a wide receiver plan set up. So that should be a number one goal for Mike Elko, how to get all of these wide receivers that you have that have proven that they can be talented to really understand certain roles in this offense. Then the name of the game after that in their rotation is certainly more transfer-oriented. You had Noah Thomas, who was a JUCO transfer. Now you bring in Cyrus Allen of Louisiana Tech fame. He had the most yards, actually, out of anyone on this Texas A&M wide receiver room at 778. So that should tell you a lot about the pratfalls that this position group has had to overcome or will have to overcome in the future if they want to get back to the upper echelon of SEC powerhouses. Let's talk about Connor Wegman for a second, because I think he's a very interesting young quarterback who, the bottom line with him being, he's going to be a star. I think last year, had, Connor Wegman played a full season, we could very well be talking about Jimbo Fisher seeing out his contract. But I think that he didn't necessarily save face because he was injured all the time. But also, I feel like Connor Wegman's one of those 5-star recruits where you have to let him kind of develop at his own pace. I think that Jimbo Fisher, had he remained head coach, would have pushed him way farther than a 5-star recruit should ever go. We saw it a little bit with Haynes King in his tenure. We saw it a little bit with Max Johnson when he had to come in and play. There always seems to be a pushy aspect of what Jimbo Fisher was doing at the QB position. But now that Mike Elko's coming in, he had Riley Leonard, who was the epitome of overcoming the odds a lot. He had a lot of injuries. A lot of people really didn't understand his game, but last season proved, even though he was injured, that he does have the talent, and now we see him off at Notre Dame playing for that program. And speaking of Notre Dame, we'll get to that schedule in a bit, but overall, I do have high hopes for Connor Wegman. Now let's get to the schedule, and speaking of Notre Dame, that is Texas A&M's opening game to start the season. A unique opportunity for both of these teams, because Notre Dame feels like, as an independent, they're going to have a tough road to hoe to get to the CFP. And a win against Texas A&M, an SEC program that should, at the end of the day, be ranked in the top 20, is a huge step forward for that, because they don't have many of those games in their schedule as an independent. For Texas A&M, this will be a good barometer. This will be a good testing ground for them. If Mike Elko has a lot of things implemented, yet he understands Riley Leonard better than anyone. He understands his weaknesses better than anyone. And he knows how to exploit that. Then Texas A&M, that's a huge win for them. And then, after that, you have Missouri and LSU, two of your tougher games in your schedule, at home. And they're not necessarily the biggest SEC programs either. Obviously, Missouri, kind of were a pleasant surprise last year, but they haven't really earned the respect of the rest of the SEC or the selection committee. And then LSU is also kind of in transition. Who knows what Garrett Nussmeier will be. So getting those two at home is a huge boon to Texas A&M. And to top it all off, you miss out on Texas, Georgia, Alabama, and Ole Miss, which are all four teams that should, at the end of the day, be in the CFP. So, if you win two or all three of these games, you're in good shape if you're Texas A&M to make a push for the CFP. But it will all depend on if Texas A&M is ready to take that baby step in the right direction. Because Jimbo Fisher, the culture with him, really muddied the reputation of this program. It really made it more about money and control than just about playing the game of college football. That's what Mike Elko will bring. I'm taking the over here on wins. I have high hopes for this program. I think that they're ready to compete. I completely forgot as well that they have Texas home. I'm really excited that that rivalry is getting revamped. And I'm hyped for that game. But I really have hope for this program. I really do. I like a lot of the moves they made. And by being more quote-unquote small school oriented, even though I don't like calling it that, Texas A&M took a massive step in the right direction, and their win projections should only go up in the future for certain seasons. Now, that's about to do it for this segment. Coming next, we talk about the cream of the crop in the SEC, one of the most dominant teams now in New Horizons themselves. We'll be right back to talk about them right after this break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day, I do want to remind you that, for now, if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. As I have said before, this will most likely change as I become a live show. So if you would like to make yourselves available to all of the ways you can interact with my show, I would love to hear some of your inputs and opinions, especially as we get into fantasy football season. Please make yourselves available to all the ways like super chat, super thanks, and super stickers that you can become involved with the show with. But for now, gsmc.cloud is the way to go for anything of that nature. Without further ado, let's stick with this screen right here and let's talk about the dominant force in the SEC. The team that has always been the cream of the crop. Now, in a new horizon with a new head coach, we never thought we would see the day where Nick Saban would step down, but he has, and that leaves a path for Kalen DeBoer to really make this program his own. And I'm really intrigued to see how he develops this program for future seasons and future successes. And yes, of course, I'm talking about the Alabama Crimson Tide. And the reason why I still have high hopes about Alabama, not necessarily looking at the stats just yet, about their history in terms of the Nick Saban era, in terms of their winning history. The reason why I'm still high on Alabama is that I do believe that the prime goal of any coach is to keep as many players as possible, and also bring in as many players as possible. And Kalen DeBoer has done a fantastic job of doing that. There have been some players who've left. A lot of offensive production has left, and they have come to Texas, and I'm very excited about. But looking at Alabama for now, the way that Kalen DeBoer really has honed in on the balance of bringing in new players to mitigate for the losses you have in terms of transfers from your school, and also maintaining a structure of players who have had the experience under Nick Saban and want to continue this new project with him, was admirable. And I commend him for that, because in order to develop this winning culture in a new way, you really need that level of balance in your system. But now let's get into stats. Their over-under for this year is 9.5 wins. So they are safely considered a playoff team at this point. I'm taking the over confidently. But here's a stat that should scare a lot of people and make them skeptical about what if they don't maintain this winning culture. Maybe this is the year that's bound to happen, that Alabama will finally not, win a targeted X amount of games. They haven't been under 9 wins since 2010. Really the start of the Nick Saban era, which is really telling of what Nick Saban did to reinvent this program. So no pressure, Kalen DeBoer. You're doing a fantastic job off the field. But on the field, there's a standard being set. And this over-under should be highly underwhelming to a lot of Crimson Tide fans if, you always consider your team as a 10, 11, 12 win season. But it certainly seems as if there's a lot of positives when I look at the schedule and how it pans out for Alabama, for this program. And the questions that I have surrounding Alabama aren't necessarily deep enough to really concern me enough to say, well, they're not winning 9 games. When I look at this offense, right, certainly a lot of players are going to have to step up. They don't have Bond anymore. They don't have Black anymore, who showed flashes of being a solid tight end. They don't have Roydell Williams anymore. But at the end of the day, Kalen DeBoer did a fantastic job of diagnosing places where, he knew he was going to lose production and saying, okay, how can we rebuild and retool this roster? He maintained a lot of young players. Most importantly, Jalen Milroe is still there to continue his improvement as an Alabama Crimson Tide player. And also, he brought in his own kind of depth, Jeremy Bernard, a player who actually didn't see that much playing time at the University of Washington, but Kalen DeBoer must have thought very highly of, comes to Alabama. You still have Kobe Prentice and Kendrick Law, 2 players who I talked about recently on the show as players who haven't yet had breakout seasons for the Crimson Tide, but are looking to step up into those big roles. And also, I like that, Kalen DeBoer is not necessarily worried about production, I think. Which seems kind of cliche to say that a coach shouldn't be worried about production, but when I think about Kalen DeBoer, and I think about what he did at University of Washington, I think he was highly reliant on Michael Penix's knowledge of his system and his knowledge of his wide receivers. Now, this Alabama Crimson Tide certainly does not have the same wide receiver room as what Washington had, but certainly has pieces that Jalen Milroe will know a lot better than Kalen DeBoer. Very rarely does a young quarterback like Jalen Milroe, who's only going into his second full season as a starter, know a lot more than a head coach. And that should really help Kalen DeBoer develop, a system where every single player is comfortable. Because at the University of Washington, his job was simplified to the point where Michael Penix Jr. and his wide receivers were comfortable with however the game went in terms of their offensive game plan. And I see a similar thing happening with Kalen DeBoer and Jalen Milroe, because Jalen Milroe, like I said, he already had the experience under Nick Saban to boot. So when I think about Alabama and their outlooks for the season, I think that the connection between DeBoer and Milroe is going to be the key and the X factor to potentially unlock the untapped potential of this team. Let's get into the schedule, because it is very fortunate that all of Alabama's quote-unquote tough games are almost all at home. You get Georgia, Missouri, and Auburn in the Iron Bowl in Tuscaloosa. That's a huge benefit to them, because if you feel like Georgia's weakness is kind of playing in an uncomfortable setting, because last year in the SEC championship game, you had them in a neutral site where, the stadium was kind of 50-50, and most of the fans there were balanced. If you can lure them into that kind of trap, lure them into an early deficit on the road, then that's the way you can beat Georgia. And then Missouri and Auburn, I don't necessarily think Missouri could be a huge game, because those are two teams that potentially are going to sneak in the back door of the playoff, right? Because they're either going to be 2 or 3 lost teams who the committee really likes still, but they're going to have to sneak in a little bit, maybe be the 8 to 9 seeds. So this game could really be huge for that seeding implication. Then on the road, they go to Wisconsin, not necessarily the biggest non-conference game. They have Tennessee, LSU, and Oklahoma away. Now, those are all winnable games. The Tennessee game, who knows what Nico Yamalira is? There's a lot of hype surrounding him, but it's just hype as of right now. LSU, again, hype. Garrett Nussmeier had a couple of good games. He had his best game in that bowl game. And then Oklahoma as well. Hype. What is Jackson Arnold? Hasn't even started a game, really. And so, thinking about Alabama, and thinking about the history of the program, and thinking about how Kalen DeBoer and Jalen Milroe will develop together, I see no reason as to why people should shy away from taking the over here. And it's an even betting line. It's an even line right now. So there's no kind of trepidation you should have to say, well, maybe Alabama might have a down year. I don't know how this transition from Saban to DeBoer is going to go. There should be no trepidations there. Because at the end of the day, when I think about this Alabama team and I think about the schedule, I don't necessarily see many pratfalls. And you could cite, well, you talk about the wide receiver room and the problems that they might potentially face. Well, when I think about the wide receiver room, these are guys who still have the Alabama experience. These are guys who want to make an impact. Kobe Prentice and Kendrick Law weren't necessarily, kind of sucked from of playing time because of, anything to do with their status. It was just that there were so many receivers that Alabama highlighted that Kobe Prentice and Kendrick Law really didn't get that much playing time. And so, this is a real opportunity for Alabama to grow and develop. And this season, I don't necessarily think it needs to be a season where they place so much emphasis on winning even. Which is weird to say because I'm still so high on them. But I think the emphasis that needs to be placed on this team has to stem from developing the understanding that Kalen DeBoer had with Michael Penix and having it translate to Jalen Milroe. Because the biggest part about this whole experience is that Kalen DeBoer now is a young QB, whereas Michael Penix was someone who had been through the ringer, had a lot of experience in college football, really found his name at University of Washington, and really made his bones by getting that connection with Kalen DeBoer and also having a solid wide receiver room. Now, this is more of a project. You have all the pieces. Now the puzzle is the connection. And the connection, as the season goes on, will continue to grow. But Kalen DeBoer should ultimately place most of his trust in Jalen Milroe, because Jalen Milroe is the future of the Alabama Crimson Tide. He's the reason why this team has so much optimism, despite losing the power of Nick Saban. And in terms of betting odds, you could be skeptical. You could not heed my advice and say, well, I can't pick a team that's transitioning from such a powerful head coach who really made an imprint on the program to another guy. But the history, the job Kalen DeBoer has already done to retain most of this roster, and that Jalen Milroe stayed, most importantly, should give you a lot of hope and optimism about this Alabama team. That will just about do it for this segment of today's show. Coming up, we talk about perhaps a pleasant surprise last year and a team that should be no surprise if they do well this year in the SEC. That's definitely going to be a nice little segment to talk about right after this break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you like those two segments showing kind of the dichotomy of a team in the SEC that really wants to start anew, get back to their ways of winning, and a team that has all that history in the SEC, also in kind of transition mode and wanting to maintain their little success. Let's talk about an SEC team that really just burst onto the national spotlight kind of just last year. And they really are looking to cement themselves as a force to be reckoned with in this conference. And I really believe they have all the pieces set. This is an electrifying team that a lot of people might still be sleeping on right now. But I'm telling you, I'm high on this team. I'm so high on this team that they're my sleeper pick to win the damn SEC. Yes, I said it. Missouri Tigers have arrived. And yes, there's a lot of things that could go wrong here. There's a lot of reasons as to why Missouri could prove to be wrong. But at the end of the day, they maintained a lot of the players and roster that got them here in the first place. And they have perhaps the best wide receiver in all of college football. In terms of their schedule, they're only the 14th most difficult schedule in the entire conference. And because of that, they have a 37.3% chance to make the CFP. And when I look at all the players that they have, the production they have, I'm really excited for them. Let's start off with Brady Cook, their quarterback. When we think about quarterbacks in the SEC, well, Carson Beck, Jalen Milroe, Quentin Ewers. Let me throw Jackson Dart in there as well. We don't necessarily talk about Brady Cook, but you should be. 3,317 yards last year, 21 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. And then, of course, perhaps the best wide receiver that Missouri has ever had, the best wide receiver right now, in my humble opinion, in all of college football, Luther Burden III, 1,212 yards, 9 touchdowns. And I'm not saying that should signify, well, oh, this is an otherworldly team. It does signify that continuity in the SEC matters more than most. Because this is a quote-unquote young SEC. Teams are implementing new quarterbacks. They're implementing new coaches, new ideas, and it's certainly becoming a more fresh league. And Missouri's quote-unquote continuity is certainly something that should be pointed out and acknowledged, because having these two guys here who have that rapport with each other really sets the foot forward for the offense. And we can talk about the pass defense. We can talk about the defensive pieces they lost. They lost Darius Robinson, a huge piece off the edge. But I think that in order for Missouri to really maintain that hype, they needed that offensive production. Now, a lot of people might say, well, you didn't talk about Cody Schrader yet and how he's got a hold on the offense. Well, I think that what stems from that is Cody Schrader was a flash-in-the-pan kind of player. Nobody expected him to have as big a season. Like Ollie Gordon. He was kind of like Ollie Gordon in that regard. But in this new season, if you're the Missouri Tigers, you have to take advantage of the season more than anything. Because this could be Brady Cook's last year. It could be Luther Burden's last year. And you want to set a foundation that the Missouri Tigers, after both of those guys, after all they've given you, getting you to this point where now people are starting to talk about you. Now people know about your program. It's going to be very integral. Let's talk about their schedule a little bit. Talk about the 14th easiest schedule. You've got A&M on the road, Alabama on the road, and Oklahoma at home. Those are the only 3 games that I could pinpoint in their schedule that are really tough. So let's break them down. The most even game should perhaps be against Texas A&M. And I'm saying this because if you view both teams, they really, now that Texas A&M fired Jimbo Fisher, should be adapting to this kind of small school mindset. When I think about comparisons to them, let's go to the Big 12 for a second. Texas A&M, I didn't mention this in their little segment, but I think of Texas A&M right now as Kansas State. And I'm not just saying that because Colin Klein is their offensive coordinator. I'm saying that because Connor Wegman, in many regards, kind of reminds me of Will Howard. A very, serviceable guy. Well, Connor Wegman was a 5-star recruit, so you can't describe him with words. It's serviceable, but if he's serviceable enough, that should be enough for Texas A&M. And then when I look at Brady Cook on the other side of the coin for Missouri, he also brings that element of serviceability. Just enough to get it done. That's the most even game on their schedule. It's also a game that could be a jockeying game for seeding position. I think that Missouri right now kind of profiles as maybe a 9 to 10 seed in the new look CFP, but that could change. And this game could be the barometer for that. It should be a huge game for that. Then let's talk about Oklahoma at home. And I mean, that game, in many respects, I don't necessarily view as a must-win for Missouri. Because I think that Oklahoma, while I did pick them in terms of the over, aren't necessarily going to be challenging for the CFP at this point. I picked the over, but barely. I think that they're an 8-4 team at best. And I think that there's a little more margin for error for Missouri than there is for Oklahoma, because Oklahoma has a much tougher schedule. In Alabama on the road, that's the game that you really dream about. That's the game you circle on the calendar. If you take down Alabama when they're considered to be a bit weaker, now they don't have Nick Saban coaching, that says a lot of the steps forward that you have taken as a program. So, while there aren't many games to circle on the calendar for Missouri to really target, if you win the Alabama game, that says a lot about you. Let's talk about how this all sets up for the playoff. In my mind's eye, you have all the conference champions, so I'll go through them. SEC. It's easy. I think Georgia wins it ultimately. I'm sorry, but it's Georgia and Texas at the top teams. Texas will probably be the 5 seed. Then we go to the Big Ten. It's a toss-up, but I'll go Ohio State. Then the ACC. I'm going to toss up. I'm going to go Florida State here, just has the most upside. Then I go Big 12. I'm going to pick Kansas State just because I have a lot of trust in that team. They know what they're doing. They've had the experience. The next 5 or so teams should all, outside of a group of 5 team, who I'm very excited to talk about at the end of today's show, should all come from either the SEC or the Big Ten. So you have, let's say, 4 SEC teams making the playoff, 3 Big Ten, and then potentially the group of 5 team comes in at the 12 seed as the 6th highest ranked conference champion. If Missouri can position themselves somewhere in the 11 to 10 range, you can get a decent game against, say, an Oregon. Maybe if they're decent this year, throw in Washington. Or another SEC school that isn't as tough as, say, a Georgia, an Alabama, or a Texas, say, an Ole Miss. An 11-7 matchup against Ole Miss isn't necessarily something that you'll be panicking about. And I'm telling you, if Missouri sneaks in as a lower seed, and they could have been deserving of a higher one, then they're the scariest team in the entire CFP. I'm sorry. Because for so long, Missouri have been trying to get to this point. For so long, Missouri have tried to get into the national spotlight. And now that they have the players to do so, I truly think that if they have that chip on their shoulder, if they are a lower seed than most of the other teams in the SEC, that is the impetus for them to go on a nice little run here. And I wouldn't be surprised if they get to the semifinal or something in the CFP. I wouldn't. That's how much respect they have for what Eli Drinkwitz, Brady Cook, and Luther Burden have done to this team. Let's talk about a potential CFP matchup. As the 11th seed, depending on, whether or not they go to the CFP or semifinal, you are looking at an 11-7 matchup, I believe. Let's say Ole Miss is that 7 seed. I have a lot of trepidations about picking that game because I think it's going to be the best game if that really does happen. It's going to be a classic shootout. Both of these quarterbacks are guys who feel like they had a chip on their shoulder over the years. And I do think that at the end of the day, Missouri, yes, I would say that right now they might not be on the level of an Ole Miss, but they have potential. And if it's, say, LSU that gets that 7 seed for some reason, then I definitely would pick Missouri in that situation. Then let's go to potential quarterfinal. They are a low seed, but let's say Liberty loses their first game. They'll be the lowest seed. They would face, say, the 1 seed against Georgia, and that's just a crapshoot. These are one-off games now, not, a game where there's so much at stake, where it's a 4-team CFP and it's just a pressure cooker environment to try and get to the championship game. No, there's more margin for error, and it's a team that knows about margin for error. It's Missouri. And if you're telling me that Missouri has a chance in a one-off game to beat Georgia after, having a chip on their shoulder, after trying to get to this point, trying to get to the point where they are nationally relevant, then who's to say that they can at least put up a decent fight? There's a lot of issues as well with being this high on Missouri, saying that around the same as Texas A&M, 8.5 wins. But if you take the over, you might be pleasantly surprised here. And taking the over really should be the best bet. You're looking at a schedule where if the only games that are really eye-popping are A&M, Oklahoma, and Alabama, that's much less daunting than Georgia's, much less daunting than Texas's, even though Texas isn't as daunting, much less daunting than A&M's, a little less daunting than Alabama's even. So you have, if you're Missouri, have to take advantage of this situation, and if you're a bettor, you should consider betting the over on this, because this is a team that's shocking no one no more. And so the hope that I have for Missouri is high, and I hope that you kind of take this to heart and bet on them a little bit more. let's just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we have our only Big Ten school of the day, a school that really hasn't gotten over their big, massive hump of beating Ohio State and Michigan. That should give away what this team is, but we'll talk about them a little bit more after this quick break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We now transition for the first time from the SEC to the Big Ten. Let's talk about perhaps a team that has lost a lot of its luster now because of the Big Ten's conference realignment situation. Now, this team's massive hurdles and pratfalls in the recent past and beating Ohio State and Michigan have become large. Because now you incorporate a lot of Pac-12 teams, a lot of travel situations into this new schedule. But Penn State certainly has a lot of appeal to it. They have one of the best college football home environments in the country. They have a coach in James Franklin who, even though hasn't necessarily kept them on schedule or ahead of schedule in terms of beating Ohio State and Michigan, has kept the course and stayed the course in terms of hitting 10-win seasons. And maybe as a Penn State player and as a Penn State coach, 10 wins should be enough. But conference realignment really does mess with things. But in positive aspects, maybe Penn State dodged a bullet here. Without further ado, let's talk about them a little bit because they become now the wild card, the monkey wrench in the Big Ten, so to speak. Now, if you're a Penn State fan, there's a reason for you to have a lot of trepidations surrounding what you saw out of the offense last year, surrounding what you saw out of Drew Aller last year. For someone with so much hope, so much optimism surrounding him at the QB position, a position where, Penn State really hasn't placed a lot of faith in terms of recruiting big-name QBs, to have someone like Drew Aller, who is a 5-star recruit, play like that, not necessarily pass a lot, all the frustrations with running the football, even though you do have fantastic running backs now. I do get why people wouldn't be high on Penn State, but this is a team that has consistently hit the 10-win threshold time and time again, only not losing to Ohio State and Michigan, and now that doesn't necessarily matter. And here's why I'm more high on Penn State. I'm taking the over on them. The over on them is about 9.5. They don't play Michigan or Oregon this year. And Oregon is the only team from the Pac-12 that I feel like right now will compete for the Big Ten title and those odds there. When I look at the rest of their schedule, I only see 2 games where they could potentially find fault with. They're away at USC. That should be a very intriguing game because these are 2 quarterbacks in drastically different points of their careers. Drew Aller with a point to prove, and Miller Moss with a point to prove that he should be the quarterback of the future for USC. And so that game really, if Penn State doesn't get dragged into that a little bit, then I do believe that they have a chance to get that win. And then they're home to Ohio State. And there's no better home environment, like I said, than Happy Valley. And Ohio State, yes, they're probably going to be a tough team to play, getting all the hype. But at the end of the day, like I say, they're just good on paper. Doesn't mean anything to me if they don't win all their games. Doesn't mean anything right now. And so Penn State has to say, hey, if they're sitting pretty, let's say Penn State is undefeated. They don't have a tough, non-conference or conference slate. Let's say if they're about undefeated, before they face Ohio State. They'll be like, hey, no matter where Ohio State is, remember, these guys all transferred in. Yeah, they have Ibuka, but these are just young guys. Will Howard's a transfer. He is the question mark here. That should be the message for them. And if they get past those two teams, that's it. It's like ripping off a Band-Aid. If they get past those two teams, they don't play the only other two teams in this conference who shouldn't matter. And so, that's why I believe that Penn State has good odds here. Remember, there's no longer divisions either in the conference. You no longer have to win the Big Ten East or West. You just have to be the second best team in your conference. And with Oregon also being in the mix, if Penn State is there and thereabouts, you should be a high seed in the CFP at the very least. Now, I think the bigger odds here for Penn State are the odds to get to the Big Ten conference game. And I think that their 50% odds speak a lot to the top heaviness of the conference. Because right now, all the hype's looking at Ohio State. You have Oregon up there. Maybe Michigan if they figure things out. But Penn State should take advantage of that. And so, I would say that Penn State right now perhaps have one of the better bets to reach the conference championship game. But let's talk about this roster a little bit more. Let's talk about Drew Aller. Only 2,000 yards, not the best in his first season as a starter. I think that this year, though, under new offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki, there's going to be a lot more verbiage in the system. I like what Andy Kotelnicki did at Kansas. And when I think about all the pieces that Penn State have, it certainly reminds me of what Kansas does, right? Drew Aller isn't necessarily a dual-threat quarterback like a Jalen Daniels or a Jason Bean, but the running backs that they had also played a big role. When I look at Penn State, their strength is in their running backs, Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton. Katron Allen certainly looks like a beast. And when I think about Penn State, that's who they lean on. Saquon Barkley before, Katron Allen, Nicholas Singleton now. And so, what I really like about all of the changes that they made is that they look at teams that they're very similar to them, and they said, if we hire this guy, what could our team be like? And I think the sky's the limit for this Penn State offense. If, Andy Kotelnicki finds the right balance between allowing Drew Aller more freedom to pass the ball down the field and also implementing a lot more of the run game. And I think the best way to go for Penn State is a lot of screen action. Just getting Drew settled down early and often, and then it opens up a lot more variation down the field. And then another big question is, well, who's the wide receiver one? Because I don't necessarily see one. Is it Julian Fleming, the former Ohio State player? Then you have freshmen Ethan Black and Josiah Brown looking to get implemented, so who knows? A lot of newness to this offense. It could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. But at the end of the day, looking at the schedule, there's no way you tell me that a team that their only worry is, well, we can't beat Ohio State and Michigan, and that is set it back. Now in a new-look 12-team CFP, not playing one of those teams, not playing another team in terms of conference realignment who's the biggest challenge to them. And the only two games are away at USC, where I think they should be a favorite, depending on how Miller Moss looks earlier in the season, and home to Ohio State in an environment so amped up and hyped around all these Penn State games that could really create tension for Ohio State. Should they get off to a rocky start, well, with Will Howard coming in as a transfer, you can't tell me that Penn State can't take advantage of this. Now, I know that when we look at the profile of all the conferences and how the selection committee will view certain conferences, the SEC will get first precedence. But 3 teams from the Big Ten, you think Ohio State will be the conference champion, or even Oregon, And then there's two kind of spots there. And who cares if it's, a lower seed or a higher seed? You're in. And that was always the goal for Penn State. And especially now that it's divisionless in terms of the Big Ten, all Penn State has to do is win the games they should. And I think, with this new offensive setup, a lot of games, whether it be non-conference or conference that you expect to win that looked shaky last year, might be a little more easy to win this year. And it's all about getting Joaller comfortable, because all the hype in the world can't necessarily save, a quarterback who's not comfortable. So that's the key there. But let's say that Penn State do sneak in. That's where I think the road will end for them. Because all these SEC teams really feel like they have something to prove. LSU only made one playoff. Ole Miss has never been. Missouri's never been. Texas A&M, if they get there, have never been. So Penn State is in a position where if you get in, you have to guarantee your place there. I'm taking the over in terms of wins at 9.5. I'm taking that over. But just so you know, that's where the road will probably end. The playoffs for them. But, like I said, taking stock and knowing that Penn State's path is much easier, I would be foolish to not tell you to bet on the over. Also, for a team that has done this several times and just hasn't beaten Ohio State and Michigan, pick the over for Penn State, but don't pick them in the CFP. That's my advice. But coming next, speaking of debutantes in the CFP, for the first time in the history of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast and this particular group of segments, we talk about a group of 5 team that should ignite into the playoffs. Hint, hint there. To close out the show in the week after the break. Hello everyone and welcome back to today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. For our last segment of the day, we have a special one. We are, for the first time, talking about a group of 5 team. And it certainly seems foolish to not talk about one, especially in the new look 12-team CFP, because of course one of them is finally going to get there. But the big question was probably, who is the group of 5 team that I want to highlight as my personal pick to make the SEC, and in terms of win projection totals, have enough to do it? And it should be no surprise to anybody. This team has so much excitement about them. They bring in Jamie Chadwell, kind of the group of 5 king in terms of what he did at Coastal Carolina, having one of the electrifying QBs in the country in Caden Salter. They return a lot of their depth. And I really think that this team, if they get into the CFP, could sneak up on a lot of people. And I'm, of course, talking about the great Liberty Flames. Remember, this was a team that was not even in the FBS a couple of years ago. The whole Hugh Freeze era, just trying to make a name for themselves, getting into the FBS, getting into Conference USA. Well deserved for Liberty, and it's a new day rising for them. And I think that Out of all the teams that I think about in the group of 5, you might look at, well, App State's up there, maybe Coastal. I'm kind of high on Troy too. I think that at the end of the day, there's no better path for a group of 5 team, a group of 5 conference champion than Liberty. They're projected to go 11 games are undefeated 57% of the time. Their over-under is 10.5. The over's minus 134. The under's plus 106. Those can't be better odds for them to go undefeated. And when I look at the schedule, it's really easy. The only hard game that I see is at App State. And I even think that they would, be able to do that. They would be able to be at App State and go there and win. They're just the better team, in my humble opinion. Then you have Western Kentucky at home. And, Western Kentucky, they're also trying to make a name for themselves in the group of 5. But at the end of the day, this is like comparing apples to oranges here. Because Liberty had a beautiful thing. They still have Caden Salter, a guy who threw for 32 touchdowns, only 6 picks. They have Treon Sibley, Kyler Austin, 2 receivers, returning, looking for bigger roles in the system. And most importantly, they have the group of 5 guru, the group of 5 coach that I really respect the most, in Jamie Chadwell. When I think about Jamie Chadwell, I think about what he did at Coastal Carolina. And I think about all the teams he had at Coastal Carolina and the grit and physicality they brought to the table. And when I think about Liberty and think about the opportunity they have, there should be no reason why they should feel any pressure, right? If you believe that you're the best group of 5 team, just prove it on the field. Yes, the selection committee will only put you at, say, the 12-11 seed because out of all the conference championships, well, you're only the 6th highest ranked. But you get a place at the table. That's the thing. The only group of 5 team to ever make the CFP in the 4-team format was Cincinnati. And the reason they did it, because they looked good in every single game. They had a game against Notre Dame, a ranked opponent, that they won. They went undefeated, and they earned their right. And now in the new 12-team CFP, if Liberty goes undefeated, and they continue to set the benchmark for the group of 5 and their play, then that should give the selection committee a lot of impetus to be more inclusive. And I'm not saying that many group of 5 teams right now deserve to be in the CFP, but Liberty can certainly make a name for themselves. Let's talk about not necessarily the schedule, but what the implications would be for Liberty if they get into the CFP. Let's say they do get into the 12th seed, because that would perhaps be the most logical kind of place for them because of their status as a group of 5 player. You face, say, the second best team in the SEC, so that would be Texas. Oh, that would be an exciting game. That would be gunslinger against gunslinger. Ewer, Salter. That would be an instant classic. Now, I would have to pick Texas in that one, and I always will root for Texas. But if Liberty can at least keep it close, if Caden Salter can prove to the world that group of 5 QBs are electrifying and exciting to watch, then doesn't that give the selection committee a little bit more impetus to say, hey, Liberty can actually compete in this? Ultimately be more inclusive in future years. Say there is talk of an approved 14-team playoff. Let's say, conference realignment happens even more and more. Let's say Florida State and Clemson leave the ACC. How is that impact, the group of 5? Because then the ACC is probably going to be one of the worst conferences in college football, even if they do add, the Pac-2 right now in OSU and Washington State. Then you have all of these teams in the SEC and Big Ten just trying to knock each other out. It's just going to be a battle royale, and then the group of 5 will have all these teams that feel like they're worthy because they have better records than all these SEC and Big Ten teams. It's really going to be a weird kind of duality there, if that did happen. But back to Liberty, and back to the importance this season for them holds. By just getting their foot in the doorway, by potentially in a matchup against a Texas team, that has had the experience before, wanting to actually win and compete in the CFP, if they keep it close, man, that's truly something the selection committee will have to be aware of. Because it pushes and pushes and pressurizes the selection committee to really understand the group of 5 deserves a place at the table. Now, in terms of, group of 5 conferences, and considering the fact that Liberty is in Conference USA, a conference where you don't necessarily have a lot. I believe Marshall is another decent team in that conference. I think the way the Liberty has to approach this season is, if we go undefeated and we blow out teams, and we get into the CFP, no matter what our seed is, we are showing up and showing out against no team should want to play us. And so that's what I love about Liberty, this feeling of reckless abandon to them. And I feel like if you're a group of 5 team, say like an App State, say like a Coastal Carolina, might have a little bit of a transitional period, say like a Troy. If, Liberty does go undefeated, you also have to bolster them as well. You also have to say, if you're App State and you lose to them, you have to give as much respect to them as you can. Because you yourselves are trying to get your foot in the door as well. You, as a group of 5 collective, have to come together and support Liberty in whatever way you can. Or whatever team emerges from the group of 5. I'm not saying let's set in stone that Liberty is going to be the conference champion that the selection committee picks. But if you really think that college football is heading in a direction where more and more teams will have the opportunity to play in the playoff, you have to be looking at Liberty, if they do go undefeated, which could not happen, to be the benchmark for you, to be your voice. And so, this is not like a pitch for, you to ultimately rush to the door and bet the over on Liberty. No. This is more of an analysis of college football as a whole, but also considering what wins mean to the group of 5, because wins to the group of 5 are much more important than wins to the SEC at the end of the day. And that's the reason why I wanted to do this segment on Liberty. Because if there's ever a group of 5 conference champion that has the resources, the understanding, the nuance to compete in the first ever 12-team CFP and make a name for themselves, it has to be Liberty. They are the only representative in my mind that I feel could understand the nuances of going up against a big boy, a Texas maybe, an Ole Miss, LSU maybe, an Alabama, and really take it to them. That says a lot about you as a team. So wins aside, if you want to bet on Liberty, bet on them winning the battle for the group of 5. Because in the future, college football is not going to look the same. And if there's any conference or any group of conferences that takes advantage of that, it's the group of 5. So yes, I'm taking the over on Liberty, and I'm confident that they have the best chance out of any in the group of 5 to win out and be a conference champion, to be considered for the selection committee. Think of this more as a pitch for what could be the future of college football. Because I could talk about win projections, but win projections can become more important when they matter to more teams. And that's the message I want to leave you with on this Friday edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And with that, that concludes our show. Thank you guys for tuning in all week. I've been Christopher Shepard. Please like, follow, and subscribe to the show. And if you do feel so inclined for now, go to the link gsmc.cloud to leave a tip or donation if you do feel so inclined. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in again. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time, a little bit of hiatus. But when we will be back, we'll be live. And this show will get even more exciting. I promise you that. Thank you yet again.